What's going on, everyone? I've got a little bit of a change of pace today. Picked up an ECX 124 scale Barrage. These are a fairly inexpensive little RC, and I thought it would be fun to kind of play around with something different for a little bit. Now, if you've never seen one of the 124 scale Barrages, I'll just give you a quick overview showing you kind of some of the highlights of it. The initial and most notable thing about it is that it is a scale design with a truck cab and a truggy style bed. It's got scale Falcon Wild Peak tires on it and beadlock style wheels, not true beadlocks. The body comes off with 4 body clips, and then underneath you're left with a ladder frame chassis, shock towers, a center mounted transmission and motor, and axles that feature a regular ring and pinion style design. The micro axles on this have a fabricated style full-size look. It's got universal drive shafts going to that center mounted transmission. You've got a chassis mounted servo and a 4-link suspension all around. It's got a scale front bumper with LED lights in it, and the receiver and ESC is a one-piece combo unit, but it does use a standard 3-wire servo, so if you wanted to change out that receiver and ESC, then you could change it without having to change that servo. The battery pack that's included is a 4.8 volt nickel metal pack. So what my plan is today is to learn what this car is all about. And I think the best way to do that is going to be to change out the bushings that this car comes with a set of fast eddy bearings. Before we start any of the modifications, I wanted to get some baseline numbers to see how my changes affected the car. First thing that I wanted to do was get a baseline weight. This thing is just a hair over 250 grams. The next thing I wanted to do was check the weight bias front to rear, because this car is a little tail heavy with the cage of the body as well as the receiver, ESC, and battery all on the back side of this. After doing a balance test and then a little bit of math, looks like I've got about a 38% front weight bias and a 62% rear weight bias. That's something that we're definitely going to want to try and flip. And the last test that I did was a side hilling test to see at what point, as I increased the angle, this thing tipped over. As I move that weight from the rear towards the front, I want to try and make sure that I keep it low to try and keep that side hilling ability at what it is or improve it. Right now, it looks like it's tipping over right around 36 degrees. So with all of that info covered, let's tear into this car and get all of the new bearings installed. Let's get all 4 tires out of the way so that we can get to everything we need to work on. These axles do use a hex and pin style drive, so remove the hex and then be careful not to drop the pin that is behind it. We'll remove the front axle first. Use your 1.5 millimeter driver to remove the lower ball stud that holds the lower shock mount and lower link. Once those are out of the way, you can remove the upper links with the same 1.5 millimeter driver. And lastly, you'll need to remove that steering linkage. So now with our front axle free, let's remove the knuckle and C-hub. With those 2 kingpin screws, you can pull off the knuckle, and the lower clamping screw will let us remove the C-hub. Once that clamping screw is removed, turn the axle shaft until the dog bones line up with the slots in that C-hub. That'll allow it to slide right off. Do the same for the other side. Before opening up the axle, let's remove the drive shaft. Then remove the 4 screws that hold the 2 halves of the axle together. With the 4 screws removed, you can then open up the axle housing. Then remove the ring gear and axle shafts as well as the pinion gear. So now we'll open our fast eddy bearings kit. Remove the pinion bearing first and then find the appropriately sized bearing to replace it with. Press it into the housing and then replace the pinion and pinion gear shaft. To keep the pinion and pinion gear shaft secured, I'm going to replace the drive shaft now. Note the shape of the pinion gear shaft and that the drive shaft will only go on in one way. Now, these inner bearings do seem to be quite a bit more tricky. The bushing was installed after the small dog bone pin was installed. This is a one-piece front shaft. So in order to install this bearing, I had to press this pin out slightly with a pair of my needle nose. And then remove the bushing, slide the new bearing on, and then tap the pin back into place. Now we're going to reinstall the front axle shaft back into the housing. Replace the 4 screws that hold the front housing together. So next we'll do the bearing swap on the knuckle. Push that stub axle out and then remove the 2 bushings from the knuckle. I'm going to grab my fast steady bearings and push them into place. So then we're going to replace that stub axle. Then we're going to reinstall the C-hubs. I'm going to take and relocate the position of where that clamping screw is towards the backside and the top of the knuckle, just for one less thing to catch on anything while you're driving this thing on the terrain. With the C-hub on, we can replace the knuckle. Make sure not to over tighten the kingpin screws that hold the knuckle in place, otherwise you could make that knuckle hard to turn and potentially damage your servo. Next, we're going to remove the rear axle just like we removed the front. Remove the screw holding the clamping lockout in place. Then just slide the lockout off of the axle housing. The rest of the axle will disassemble just like the front. With the rear axle removed, these bushings simply slide off the rear axle shafts. No need to worry about the pins. Slide the new bearings in place and your rear axle shaft is ready to install. Replace the pinion bearing in the rear axle just like we replaced the front pinion bearing. With the pinion bearing replaced and the ring gear bearings replaced, we can now reassemble the 2 axle halves, and then we can replace these bushings on the outside of the rear straight axle adapters. When you're reinstalling the 2 halves of these axles, make sure that the 2 pins that are molded into the axle half on the front side are opposite to the ring gear. The same goes for the back half of the axle where it's got 2 pins as well. Those will interfere with your ring gear and bind up your truck if you don't get those put on the correct side. With the bearing installed in the rear lockout, I'm going to reinstall these. Again, I'm going to put the clamping portion of that lockout on top of the axle for one less hang point again. There is a notch on the axle for that clamping screw to go through, but it doesn't feel like the interference is enough to worry about, and I think that the benefit of the smoother axle housing is going to be worth it. With both axles done, let's remove the transmission from the chassis with the 3 screws located on the bottom of the skid plate. With the 3 screws removed, you can remove the transmission from the chassis. You can disconnect the motor wires by pulling the plug on the top of the ESC receiver combo. We'll remove the 2 screws holding the motor cover on and the 2 screws holding the drive shafts on. Underneath the spur gear cover, we can see the spur gear and pinion. We're not going to touch the motor screws at this point. We're only going to remove that spur gear. Now we're going to remove the 5 screws holding the 2 halves of this transmission together. With those 5 screws removed, we can pull off that back cover of the transmission. Inside, we get to see the 4-gear transmission. Now we need to remove all of the gears and shafts to remove the bushings from both halves of the transmission and replace them with the remaining bearings from our Fast Steady Bearings kit. After pulling all the gears out of the front half of this transmission case, we can see that there is a shim that is placed on the inside of that lower bushing. I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall this shim after I replace the bearings, just because that I assume they put this shim in there to keep from some sort of interference, or maybe they were just fine-tuning their gear mesh. These dental picks are an absolute lifesaver for things this small. They're really inexpensive as well. I'll put a link to where I get them below. To reinstall the bearings on the front half of this transmission, I'm going to push the bearings onto the gear shafts and then replace them with the gears. And again, while reinstalling that bottom bearing, I am going to replace that shim. Now we're going to close this transmission back up and replace all of the screws that we took out before. So now we slide that spur gear back into place. Then we're going to replace the lock nut that holds it into place. Don't over tighten that though. You don't want to induce any bind into the transmission. We want to make sure that everything is spinning as smoothly as possible, especially now that we've taken the effort to go through and replace everything with bearings. We can tell now that everything spins nice and smooth, and we don't have any forward to backward play, so I think we're in pretty good shape. Something else that I think is probably worth noting is that on the back of the motor, you can see that there's a red dot. I believe that should be indicating that that is the positive side, even though you can see that the negative side is connected to it. Most motors like this have a little bit of timing put into them. So I'm gonna check that, and then I'm also going to look at putting it back into the car in the opposite direction. The reason that I'm going to look at changing the direction of this is for 2 reasons. One, I think that it could get the motor spinning in the proper direction. And 2, I think that this motor may actually have a better forward bias if it was run in the opposite direction. But we'll test that before we put it in. I'm more concerned about the weight bias than I am about the direction of the motor spinning. I'm going to completely remove the skid plate from the vehicle and remove all of the lower links as well. With just a very simple test, I think we can see that the motor side is obviously much heavier than the front side. So I'm going to go ahead and spin the whole transmission around and reinstall it back into the chassis. So we got everything reinstalled on this little truck. To do that motor and transmission flip, I did have to extend the wires a little bit. And while I was doing that, I reversed the polarity on the plug rather than just using the switch in the radio. It's a modification that will have a small effect, but in the end, when we add up everything that we're gonna do, I think that it'll be worth it. So that's gonna cover everything I'm gonna do on this video for now. You can follow along on the next videos when I'll replace the ESC, the receiver, and relocate that battery. So thanks for following along, guys. This is a fun little change of pace, and I'm looking forward to playing around with this thing a little bit more. Thanks for following along, guys. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're interested, and thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.